I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today is
Part 4
of our Shioji Journey to the West series.
We are still journeying, 4 steps into the journey.
How far are we journeying to?
Well, not to the west, that's for sure. I'm going east soon. I'm heading to France. That's the opposite direction of our podcast.
This podcast will come out after you're already in France.
Well, we could choose to air it earlier, but yeah, probably. Yeah, after I'm in France. When I've journeyed to the east.
I don't even think we have enough time.
I don't think we do. Not enough time to edit it and get it out there. Unless we wanted to have some massive week-long crush of Journey to the West podcast. No one wants that.
Nope.
So, I'll mention this, Lee. You and I recorded the first 3 episodes. Life became insane. And it's been quite a gap between then and now. And I mention that because in going back and looking at this text again, 2 things strike me. 1, Anthony Yu's translation really is pretty amazing. Yeah. 2, this is an unbelievably tedious piece of literature.
I think we've talked about that in the previous episodes.
Yes.
We resisted doing this series because we actually don't really like.
Yeah, well, you and I talked, there's sections like chapters 1 to 7, which was an earlier podcast, really are pretty gripping. Like that, if that was the whole thing, just that novel, it would be pretty thrilling.
And it's important to keep in mind, as we discussed in the podcast that we did on chapters 1 through 7, that might actually be a separate text that's just kind of been sewn on top of this other text.
If so, someone knew what they were doing when they put that in there. My reason for mentioning that it's tedious is not to insult it, but to set ourselves up for today's discussion, which is a way to read this text in a way that makes it not so tedious. And I'll mention this as by way of sort of setting up our discussion here, and you can explain a little more about the nuts and bolts of this. The Journey to the West works a lot like superhero fiction, in that when you encounter a superhero, many of them seem to almost have godlike powers, and you're left wondering, why doesn't this particular figure just always win? Like, what's stopping this person?
What is their kryptonite?
What is their kryptonite? But every superhero does have some sort of flaw, some sort of weakness. This goes all the way back to Greek mythology, right? There's always some tragic flaw.
An Achilles heel, if you will.
Literally, in his case, that makes the character both more relatable and also creates a lot of the drama, right? So, if there's kryptonite anywhere in a story, Superman's going to stumble on it, and you're waiting for that moment to happen.
It's the sort of Chekhov's gun of Superman, right?
Exactly. This absolutely is the case with Journey to the West. We're not knowing this. You read the Journey to the West as a sort of endless series of battles with people with unbelievably obscure and weird names in places with obscure names.
But the point of the story is like a superhero story in that it's recognizing the patterns. It's not so much reading it as a novel. And at the beginning of this podcast, I joked, "Is this a novel?" But I'm kind of serious. It's a picaresque. It's so we're using the technical term of romance. That is one of those things that's just kind of more from the medieval period. These kinds of literature were much more common during medieval European period. They represent this kind of, I hate to say it, but a sort of less enlightened state of literature where things are kind of cyclical and like the same sort of story keeps happening over and over again in different versions.
And they continue to succeed, these kinds of stories do. In a way, it almost works like detective fiction now, because
I think your comparison to superhero fiction is actually spot on.
Well, and a lot of the genre, what they call quote-unquote genre fiction, continues to be so popular because people get used to a certain dynamic, and they're reading for the various ways a story kind of messes with that dynamic or takes it in a slightly different direction or gives you a particular villain who's a perfect foil that came out of nowhere for the superhero, stuff like that. It's comforting. It's a kind of story you keep coming back to because it just seems to never get old.
I had a professor who compared this to a car chase scene that you see in a film. That is, all of like you've seen a million car chases. And if you've seen one car chase, you've seen them all. And you know the parameters, but seeing how they mess with the genre and what has to be in there and then that one thing that's missing and you're kind of like, when is it going to come?
Right.
When is it going to come?
And, if you can step back a little bit from the novel and expecting the characters to change over the course of the novel, which superheroes don't particularly need to change, right? We're not expecting Superman or Batman or Spider-Man to suddenly develop a love for Persian poetry or something. That's not required of the stories to be successful. When you can take that step back and realize this is a set of very similar adventures, what we're looking for is alternations in a pattern. It's a lot more interesting. And what's that pattern? We keep coming back to this idea, but can you explain a little bit what kind of pattern we're talking about?
So essentially, I'm going to be talking about the Maram Epstein way of reading Shioji, this novel, The Journey to the West, which is to look specifically at the patterns. So Maram Epstein is, Rob, you've taken a class with her too, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
She is one of the great professors we have at the University of Oregon, and she has developed this methodology for reading all of these Ming Qing classical novels that essentially involves looking for different aspects of numerology, but also kind of looking at dynamics of yin and yang, that's feminine and masculine for those of y'all who haven't heard other episodes, and kind of understanding the almost solar system-like universe that you have kind of constructed around these characters.
And that sounds really abstract and weird, but it's actually much simpler than it sounds, and we're going to get to that here in just a second.
If you think about the 5 characters in the novel, you have Tang Monk at the center, and he represents the head. In terms of, like, if you think of each of the 5 characters as a part of the body, Tang Monk represents the center, he represents the head, and he has a color associated with him, yellow. That's the imperial color. So he kind of represents the government, orthodoxy, that kind of thing. Then surrounding Tang Monk, you have all of the 4 characters. So that's Sandy, Pigsy, Monkey, and the White Horse. We don't really talk that much about the White Horse and Sandy.
Yeah. They're the Zeppo marks of the group. They're just there to sort of set up everybody else.
Yeah, and you know, like, those characters may have kind of been added on later on in the novel's development. So the 2 main characters are Pigsy and Monkey. Pigsy sometimes being called Jubajie or 8 Rules. Monkey, he has a bunch of names. Pilgrim, a bunch of different things. But the thing you should note is that Monkey he's a fiery character, so he has a problem with his temperature, and he is associated with the color red and the direction of south and the season of summer and fall. He's also associated with metal and with the direction of west and autumn. Pigsy is associated with the colors green and red as well. He's associated more with spring and summer rather than Monkey, who's associated with summer and fall. Pigsy is more associated with east and south, and Pigsy is actually a horny character.
Yep.
That's his thing. So Monkey has a lot of different vices. He'll get angry, he'll pop off, he'll explode. He's arrogant. But one thing he doesn't do is he doesn't
sleep around.
He doesn't sleep around. He never gets horny.
Nope.
In any part of this novel, whereas that's pretty much all Pigsy does.
Yep.
And that's how Pigsy's always getting into trouble. And just in case you're wondering, calling a man a pig works exactly the same way in Chinese as it does in English. Thank you for those Saved by the Bell references,
Exactly. Rob. I actually don't even think I ever watched Saved by the Bell. I've only seen clips. I moved around a lot as a kid. We didn't have Saved by the Bell in the Middle East. Now, all these associations, if you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, I don't remember any of those.
We're going to put that on a chart on the website.
We're going to put it on a chart, but the most important thing to remember is each of those things represents a thing that, or a motif for a time when that character is going to be strong or weak.
Yeah. Or the opposite. I mean, in the opposite, it would be weak. So, for example, Monkey is associated with red. He's associated with fire because of his temper. So, every time you see water, go, uh-oh, Monkey's going to have trouble.
Case in point, the chapter that we wanted to talk about today to kind of illustrate this,
which is chapter 22.
Called 8 Rules, who is Pigsy, also called Jubajia, 8 Rules, fights fiercely at the flowing sand river. Moxa, by order, receives Wu Jing's submission. Lots of stuff in there. But effectively, this is a great example of what we're talking about because Tang Monk, sometimes called Tripitaka, and his sort of acolytes arrive at this river. Monkey, being possessed of way more abilities than any of the other characters. He looks at the river and goes, well, I could just jump right across it. That'd be easy. You, on the other hand, it's going to take way longer, and you couldn't cross it in 10,000 years. And Tripitaka goes, well, then how are we going to do it, right? And so some of the early drama is them trying to figure out how to cross, but there's a monster that lives in the river. Both Monkey and Pigsy fight the monster. Neither wins.
But Monkey says specifically that he can't go near the water. Right. He says in the Anthony Hughes translation, he says on page 424, it cramps my style.
Yeah. The full quote here is 8 Rules, the pig, is basically asking, why do you keep interrupting my fight? Why don't you, if you're so strong, why don't you just do something about this monster? There's a little passage where Monkey, here called Pilgrim, says, worthy brother, in this case, I've really nothing to brag about, for I'm just not comfortable doing business in water. If all I do is walk around down there, I still have to make the magic sign and recite the water repelling spell before I can move anywhere. And even when he is in water and Monkey can take the forms of different things.
He's pretty much Superman. He can take different shapes. He can fly.
But when he's in water, he can usually only assume a shape that's kind of weak and like a crab or a small fish or something. Yeah. And so Monkey is also aware that he's not going to probably be able to defeat this monster on his own. And neither can Pigsy, really, though Pigsy does his best. And so when you come across this, as you're reading the novel, you immediately go, uh-oh, there's a giant river, and there's no obvious way to get across it, so Monkey's not going to be able to do a whole lot with this monster. And that kind of dynamic comes up a lot. With these characters, there is only one way fully around this weakness, and that's an appeal above to the Bodhisattva, the goddess in charge of basically making sure that they get where they're supposed to go.
Which is pretty much the Deus Ex Machina that always occurs.
They can always appeal to, and it's one of the peculiar things if you're reading this novel, you come across this and you ask yourself, why don't they just always, at any time there's trouble, say, hey, Bodhisattva, can you help us out? Because this is, we could use some help here.
One of the points of this novel is a Buddhist metaphor about teaching you to ask for help from the Buddhist forces, right?
And yet there has to be some struggle. Not only are they just simply arrogant, they don't want to ask for help, these characters don't, but they're supposed to try to realize their limits before they ask for help. And Monkey almost never does. Monkey almost never realizes that he's inadequate to the task, even when he knows he's not good in water.
Again, his sin is pride and wrath, right? Those are things that he's really bad about. He never wants to ask for help.
No.
As the novel progresses, he gets better at asking for help.
And in this novel, in this particular chapter, it's not a particularly complicated chapter.
Rob, can you explain just what happens in the chapter?
Well, there's a lot of fighting. They try to cross the river. They can't because this monster keeps jumping up out of the river and attacking them. 8 Rules fights. Each time 8 Rules or Pigsy fights the monster, eventually Monkey can't stand it and goes and fights as well. And neither of them ever really wins.
And as the monster learns that Monkey and Pigsy are sort of able to tag team him, the monster becomes cleverer and cleverer. So in a way, Monkey's his impatience, which is another sin that he has, his impatience causes the monster to get farther and farther from being captured, which is Monkey's goal.
Right, because the river, this is something else we should point out, not only is this a river, it's a freaking huge river. This river is so big and there is so much water that Monkey's powers are way more limited. So yeah, the monster does start to flee down, so Monkey realizes he's probably not going to be able to catch it or defeat it on his own. Then, finally, he appeals to the Bodhisattva, who basically says to him, you're an idiot. Why didn't you come to us with this earlier? Because that monster in the river was a creature that we swore to serve the Tong monk years ago. If you had simply said to the monster, we serve the Tong monk back there, we're going in search of the scriptures, he would immediately have helped you to cross and walked with you the rest of the way. But because you're arrogant...
How Monkey could have known that is never really explained in the text. But during the fight scene, there is kind of this comedy of errors where the monster is like, hey, tell me your name. And he's like, no,
my name.
Yeah, let's fight. I mean, it's kind of this weird scene that only really makes sense after Monkey goes and learns that he should have just asked for the monster's name.
Monkey, for most of the novel, appears to have almost limitless powers But here he comes up against a force that is his opposite, and there's so much of it, he's almost helpless to defeat it. And in appealing to the bodhisattva for help, at least according to the Buddhist metaphor here, realizes his limitations, gets the help he needs, and is able to overcome even a mighty weakness.
This chapter begins by stating that summer was turning into fall, and if you remember, the seasons associated with Monkey are summer and fall.
Yep.
So even though Monkey doesn't do super well with water, you know that Monkey is going to be playing a role in defeating this monster.
Yes.
And it is Monkey who actually goes to the Bodhisattva, right? Like
right.
Pigsy doesn't travel to the Bodhisattva. It's Monkey who, with his ability to leap tens of thousands of miles, goes and hangs out.
Yeah.
So when you see that season, you have to know, hang on, Monkey has some strengths here.
Right. But again, and this is an example of what we mean when we say a lot of the drama and the appeal of the novel is a variation on the genre. So you start reading this chapter, it's fall, and you should be saying, aha, this is Monkey's season. He is going to seriously kill somebody or win a battle here. But then they come across an absolutely gigantic river.
And you know Monkey is... Hang on, wait a second. What's going on? He's going to have trouble, but it's his season.
And that's the tension, right? It's not the kind of dramatic or tragic tension we're used to in a lot of quote-unquote good novels. This is a case of you have this one thing that's supposed to make him strong, meeting this other thing that makes him weak. As a reader, you go, well, wait, which is going to win then?
I want to push back against you on that. You said, it's not what we think of in good novels. I don't think that's correct. I think that you should look at it as a different kind of genre. You have these expectations of quote-unquote literature with a capital L, where there's going to be character development and things like that. There's not really much character development in this, but I don't think it's any different from any other superhero novel.
And I said the word good with a laugh, knowing that it was going to be. But you're right. No, you're dead right.
I don't think they could see your raising of the eyebrow.
Yeah, but they heard me go, good novel. Hopefully they heard that. If not, I'm a snobby elitist all of a sudden. But
which you are.
Which we are, yeah. We are. Are you kidding? You're getting a PhD. You're de facto elitist. No, you're right. That every style of writing has its own sort of internal logic and rules. And even quote-unquote realism works that way. You know certain things are going to happen in a realist novel, or you expect certain things to happen, right? And how it plays off of those expectations is where a lot of the drama is created. And the drama here is in a strength meeting a weakness. A lot of chapters, there's just weakness. As we're going to see in a podcast coming up, you have what should be a total win for Monkey that turns out not to be. So there's a lot of this playing around with these forces. Very important. And it does help to read the novel. So instead of picking it up, turning to the next chapter and going, okay, what new adventure is going to happen that I haven't read before? You're looking for a new variation on an old adventure. When
we put up the actual image that shows the different things that each of these characters are associated with, you should always go and just, when you're reading this novel, check, what is this character associated with, and how should I be reading it? Because this is actually the layer of hermeneutics. Ooh, did I just use a big word there?
See, you gave me a comeuppance a second ago for being a snobby elitist, and you just used hermeneutics. I didn't use the word hermeneutics. My word was good. I'm a man of the people.
He says as he sips his elitist beer.
That you're drinking with me, comrade.
That, this is the layer of hermeneutics that the Ming Dynasty reader would have been looking for. So if you want to read it, I mean, it's fine to read it as this kind of like superhero fiction, but if you want to read it in the sort of wink, wink, nod, nod way that the contemporaneous reader would have read it, that's how you do it.
Yep.
I think that's a good place to end it. Rob, did you like chapter 22?
Not particularly.
Yeah.
But the next podcast we've got coming up is one of the high points of the novel, so I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Chapters 59 through 61.
Yes.
When Monkey has to put out the flaming mountains.
Princess Iron Fan.
Yes. All right. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.